Hello, my name is Frank Thier, and I would like to talk to you today a little bit about constructors. So what is a constructor? I'll quote here from the Java tutorials documentation. A constructor is used in the creation of an object that is an instance of a class. We can think of a constructor like a cookie cutter being pressed into cookie dough. Depending on the shape of the cutter, which is the signature of the constructor, objects will be created in certain kinds of ways. A constructor can be thought of as a special kind of method, not quite the same as normal actual methods. I'm saying normal actual here in air quotes because they're not the same thing, so don't get them confused. They're special because they don't return anything. They have no return type, even such as void. The constructor's name matches with the class name, such as in the example here of public class, my class, which has the constructor my class. So you'll see here, my class, parentheses. That's how you would define a constructor. They can have public, private, or protected access modifiers depending on the implementation, although they're defaulted to public. They cannot be inherited by subclasses, and they cannot call themselves, which would be kind of recursive and weird. They can call other constructors, but not themselves. So how do constructors work? Constructors are called using the new operator, and they can be called any number of times, which creates and initializes a new object each time. The object is initialized with respect to the specific implementation depending on what type of constructor is being used. There are three types of constructors: a default, a no args or no arguments, and parameterized. So first we'll talk about the default constructor. So if no constructor is explicitly implemented in our code, meaning we haven't written out a constructor on our own, the Java compiler will implicitly insert a default constructor call. As shown in the picture here, the constructor call is not visible in the source code on the left. You can see that my class object is being created using the new keyword, but the actual constructor isn't visible because it's done during compilation, and it can be seen on the right in the actual class file. But how does this actually work, right? So let's tie together a few different concepts here, and I think will all make sense. First, let's quickly recall that unless explicitly defined, all classes are implicitly subclasses of the object class. Object itself has no superclass. So when we create a subclass, it is, and I'll quote again from the Java documentation here, it's said to be descended from all the classes in the inheritance chain stretching back to object. So when the Java compiler automatically includes this default constructor call, it's actually calling super, which is a no argument constructor of the superclass. Now, if the defined superclass doesn't have its own no argument constructor, there will be an error when compiling. But if there's no defined superclass, meaning that superclass is object, then there's no error because object does have a no argument constructor. That was a lot of information to take in, so just remember that if we do not define any constructors in our class, then Java will automatically call the no argument constructor from the superclass. One last interesting thing I wanted to note here, and again I'll quickly quote from the documentation. If a subclass constructor invokes a constructor of its superclass, either explicitly or implicitly, you might think that there will be a whole chain of constructors being called all the way back to the constructor of object. And in fact, this is the case. It is called constructor chaining, and you need to be aware of it when there's a long line of class descent. So now that we've talked about the no args constructor, it might actually help to define what that is, right? So very simply, the no args constructor is a constructor with no arguments. No arguments meaning no parameters are being passed in, right? There will be nothing within the parentheses in the constructor signature, as you can see in the example demo class here. You see class demo, public, demo, constructor, no parameters. Although they are not the same thing, it can be thought of as setting our own custom default constructor for your class, but they're not the same thing, so don't get them confused. However, in this case, because we're defining it ourselves, we can include any legal code inside the body of our no args constructor, whereas the actual default constructor has an empty body. So what is the point of a no args constructor? Well, we can initialize variables if needed, or as in the example here, we could output something like a string or whatever. The option is ours. This example is also interesting because we can see there's no local variable this object is assigned to, which means that it is created by using the new keyword, a string is printed to the console, and then it instantly becomes unreachable because we have no reference to it. I think it's a neat way to highlight the significance of the body of the noargs constructor. So finally, we will talk about the parameterized constructor. It is a constructor where we define the inputs ourselves, which are parameters, or the arguments, the values passed in. Here we have the class example with 3 parameterized constructors and 1 noargs constructor. This is called constructor overloading. In the main method, not pictured, we can create 3 objects, and on each line, we could pass either 2 int parameters, 3 int parameters, or 1 int and 1 string parameter, depending on what we wanted to do. Our program would call the proper constructor with respect to the number and types of parameters we passed into the constructor call when creating each object. So both primitive and non-primitive data types can be passed as parameters to constructors. So you could pass in int, string, an array. So both primitive and non-primitive data types can be passed as parameters. Remember that. So that was a fire hose of information, and there's even more that I'd like to say about constructors that I can't fit in this short talk. So let's just review some quick key takeaways. Constructors create objects. They're called using the new keyword, which creates a new object each time. There are 3 types of constructors: default, noargs, parameterized. Finally, be aware of constructor chaining, and also remember that you have to think about how constructor overloading would fit our use case. So these are the sources I used to develop this presentation, and I hope that you have a little bit better understanding of how constructors work. Thank you.